The debate hall froze as Jasmine Crockett shattered the stage with one sentence, slicing through Donald Trump and JD Vance's polished facade like a blade. What began as a polity question erupted into a national reckoning, leaving even the moderators speechless. But why did one calm voice spark panic, police reports, and a movement? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The primetime network debate stage shimmered under unforgiving lights, every angle calibrated for drama. The crowd sat in disciplined silence, their faces half lit by the glow of cameras cutting back and forth between candidates. JD Vance leaned into his moment, speaking at length about the need to tighten education budgets while insisting outcomes would not be compromised. His tone was polished, practiced, and deliberate. Beside him, Donald Trump nodded with approval, jaw set in satisfaction as though each word carried his own stamp of authority. The moderator's eyes flickered between notes and time cards, allowing Vance an unbroken runway to continue. For several minutes, the only sound was his steady delivery, laying out cuts as if children's futures were line items on a balance sheet. Then the camera returned to Jasmine Crockett. She leaned forward, her posture rigid, her voice steady but edged like steel. The air seemed to thin before she spoke. If Donald Trump and JD Vance cared as much about children in broken schools as they do about camera optics, maybe America's kids wouldn't still be learning under leaking ceilings. The sentence cracked the silence like glass. The moderator froze mid-turn, his papers suddenly clumsy in his hands. JD Vance blinked twice, unsure if he should answer or pretend not to have heard. From the edges of the stage, a low ripple of murmurs broke across the audience, punctuated by someone's audible whisper, "Oh my God." Trump clenched his jaw, his hand already reaching for the microphone, but the control room cut abruptly to break. The stage lights dimmed, the applause sign stayed unlit, and for the first time that evening, silence became the headline. What had been a routine exchange was now a rupture, a single sentence carrying the weight of an earthquake. America's living room sat in the stunned pause, waiting to see whether the night had just ended or if it had only begun. Jasmine Crockett's path to the debate stage was not a product of chance or charisma alone. Long before national spotlights captured her image, she had already built a reputation in Texas courtrooms, where case files piled so high they nearly eclipsed her small frame behind the desk. Every trial was a battle of endurance, and she learned early that the law rewarded not the loudest voice but the one carrying the most thorough record. Former colleagues still recalled her arriving to hearings with binders so heavy they left indents on her palms. For her, preparation was not an accessory, it was armor. Her philosophy was born in those small, overheated courtrooms of Dallas. Silence was never neutral. Silence, she believed, was a shield for the corrupt, a cloak that allowed powerful actors to thrive unchecked. That conviction hardened during her Freedom of Information Act fights, when city agencies stalled and delayed, hoping she would lose steam. But she did not lose steam. She filed appeals, pushed clerks, and carried paper trails through hallways until reluctant judges conceded that yes, the public had the right to know. Each victory was modest in scale, but monumental in practice. It taught her that documents outlived spin. A headline could fade, but a signed receipt carried weight forever. And that ethic guided her as she moved from courtrooms into the State House and eventually into Congress. While others sharpened their sound bites for viral clips, Jasmine carried boxes of evidence into hearings, their sheer presence a visual reminder that she never spoke without foundation. In closed-door strategy sessions, she reminded her staff of her single rule: never swing until you have the paper trail. When questioned why she sometimes stayed quiet during noisy hearings, her answer was blunt. Words without receipts only fed the spectacle. She was not interested in feeding it. She was interested in breaking it open. The foreshadowing moment came just days before the debate. A courier arrived at her office with a thin packet, its weight deceptive. Inside were glossy expenses tied to a Mar-a-Lago fundraiser, itemized in a way that read more like a luxury brochure than political accounting. Champagne towers reaching toward chandeliers, orchids imported in crates. Decor billed under the category of ambiance, a phrase almost taunting in its detachment from classrooms across America that still fought with buckets under leaking ceilings. Jasmine spread the sheets across her desk, her brow furrowed. Ava Ditt, her chief of staff, stood at the doorway with folded arms. Ava's instinct was caution. She had seen how quickly records could be twisted into narratives of personal vendetta. "They'll call it personal," Ava warned softly. Jasmine looked up from the documents, her expression unshaken. "Good," she replied, her voice carrying the calm weight of certainty. "Records stay longer than spin." In that moment, the trajectory of the debate crystallized. She did not know the exact second she would release the line, but she knew the material would find its place. Jasmine Crockett never swung without receipts, and now she had them. On the other side of the debate stage, the Trump political sphere operated like a well-oiled machine powered by spectacle. Donald Trump thrived in this environment, still wielding the same instinct that had carried him through countless scandals before. Reframe every critique as an attack not just on him but on family, on country, on identity itself. When confronted with questions of misuse or excess, his reflex was never to engage the evidence directly, but to cast it as disrespect toward America's greatness. That tactic had protected him more than once, and his inner circle remained convinced it could still shield him now. JD Vance, standing as Trump's chosen partner in that moment, projected a different kind of image. His voice was calmer, measured, shaped to reassure. Pundits billed him as the voice of reason, the bridge between the combative Trump style and the public weary of chaos. But beneath the polished cadence of his words, his policies cut deep. Budget tightening, stripped of its euphemism, meant school districts losing staff, teachers buying their own supplies, and children studying under ceilings that leaked when it rained. Vance rarely raised his tone, but the steady delivery of harsh arithmetic carried its own brand of danger. Melania Trump existed in this story at the edges, her presence often silent but never irrelevant. Her name appeared in the documents Jasmine held, attached indirectly through event expenditures. For years, her curated silence had served as both shield and brand. By saying little, she controlled much, leaving interpretation to others. Yet the expenses, orchid champagne ambiance, linked back to her orbit, a reminder that luxury and politics had intertwined under the same roofs. It was not a spoken admission, but it was a thread that could be pulled. Whereon Trump, though never directly political, often surfaced as a rhetorical shield. Allies invoked him to pivot away from accountability, framing questions about the family's use of funds as intrusions into private life. It was an old playbook. When the family brand was questioned, innocence by association was placed on the table as defense. To their base, it still resonated. To the weary public, however, the tactic increasingly felt like misdirection. The spin machine had its soldiers lined up in advance. Colby Dent, Trump's press secretary, was primed with statements about political smears. Representatives Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs, loyal chorus members in Congress, were prepared to thunder about witch hunts and partisan cruelty. Their strategy was less about disproving than about overwhelming, creating enough noise that the substance drowned in outrage. They had rehearsed these maneuvers countless times, and each believed they could run the play once more. Yet the backdrop had shifted. Beyond the stage lights, America's classrooms were collapsing into disrepair, teachers shouting into voids about resources, parents begging for answers. The nation was weary, bone-tired of hypocrisy that funded orchids while children studied beneath dripping ceilings. The public mood was no longer passive, it was raw, and into that environment stepped Jasmine Crockett with her packet of glossy receipts, ready to test whether spin could still outpace truth. The cameras rolled inside the set of Inside the Beltway, a primetime show designed for polished exchanges and moderated tension, not for explosions. The host, Philip Graves, had spent the opening 20 minutes trying to keep the debate anchored in policy platitudes. But beneath the veneer of calm, Jasmine Crockett's packet of receipts rested in her lap, untouched, until the moment arrived. Donald Trump sat across from her, framed by bright studio lights that exaggerated every gesture. JD Vance leaned slightly forward in his chair, his posture composed, rehearsed, meant to project calm strength. The studio audience, packed with political insiders and a sprinkling of undecided voters, shifted in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of electricity building. Jasmine's fingers tapped the edge of the folder, rhythm steady, her eyes fixed not on her opponents, but on the moderator. She had timed it precisely. Wait for the dismissive laugh. The smirk. the signal that the floor had opened wide enough. The moment came when Trump, with casual flourish, waved off concerns about government accountability. "We ran the best events," he said, hands gesturing as if painting the air itself. "People loved them. They brought pride to America. And anyone who says otherwise is just playing politics." The audience clapped lightly, a cue Philip Graves took to transition to another question. That was when Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but sharpened like glass. "Pride doesn't come from orchids and champagne towers built under ambiance," she said, sliding one sheet of the glossy expenses across the table. "It comes from classrooms that aren't falling apart." The air shifted instantly. Philip blinked, stammering, unsure if she had just broken debate etiquette. The camera zoomed closer to Jasmine's face, her expression controlled, her delivery surgical. Trump's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for the audience to notice. Vance's brow furrowed, his hand tightening around his notepad. "Congresswoman," the moderator tried, his tone nervous. "Are you implying?" "Not implying," Jasmine cut in, her voice clear, unshaken. "The records exist. If they deny them, fine. But stop pretending this is new." The silence that followed stretched unbearably. 10 seconds ticked like 10 years. No one moved. The studio audience, conditioned to clap or murmur, sat paralyzed. Even Philip, whose entire career depended on control, could not find a word to bridge the gap. Jasmine's calm presence filled the void, the single sheet of paper between them glowing under the lights like evidence in a courtroom. Then, with a hasty flick of his hand toward the control booth, Philip called for commercial. The broadcast cut abruptly, leaving millions of viewers staring at black screens filled with advertisements. But the fuse had already been lit. By the time Jasmine returned to her small DC apartment that night, her phone had become a grenade of notifications. Ava Ditt, her chief of staff, was already waiting at the door, hair pulled back, glasses sliding down her nose from hours staring at feeds. She barely let Jasmine set down her bag before blurting out, "It's everywhere." Jasmine glanced at her phone, screen glowing with a flood of mentions and push alerts. Clips of her calm delivery had already hit social media, framed with hashtags that surged into trending spots within minutes. Public funds, public truth, stand with Crockett. Every platform carried the same 10 seconds of silence stretched out, looped, replayed, dissected. Her face, composed and unwavering, was already a meme. Jasmine didn't flinch at the storm. She set the packet of documents on the counter and replied, "Good, maybe they'll finally listen." Meanwhile, in Mar-a-Lago's gilded dining room, the reaction was anything but calm. Trump sat at the head of a long, polished table, his plate half-handed, fork clenched in one hand. The replay of Jasmine's words played muted on a nearby television. With a sudden clang, his fork hit the china so hard that aides flinched. "Make it about family," he ordered Colby Dent, his press secretary. Dent scribbled notes, already shaping talking points about attacks on loved ones. Within hours, allies Maddox and Briggs were on the phone, promising to hammer the narrative in every appearance. Their plan was simple: drown receipts in outrage, paint oversight as harassment, and frame Jasmine's composure as cruelty. Online, the battle lines formed instantly. Supporters amplified Jasmine's quote as a rallying cry, posting side-by-side images of rotting school ceilings next to glittering fundraiser decor. Opponents struck back with "Stop the smear," calling her accusations cheap shots against a private family. The digital battlefield roared, each post escalating the stakes. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Caroline Leavitt scrolled through her feed, replaying Jasmine's composure over and over. The pause, the delivery, the refusal to waver. Leavitt knew the power of silence, having lived her own moment of unraveling in a debate months earlier. She sat quietly, haunted by the recognition of a strategy executed to perfection. But then came the shock turn. Baron Trump, the youngest and least visible member of the family, inexplicably dialed the DC police to file a harassment complaint. The details were bizarre, claims that Jasmine's words targeted him, that oversight questions crossed into personal territory. At midnight, Jasmine's phone rang. On the other end was Sergeant Duca, apologetic yet bound by duty. "Congresswoman," he said cautiously, "we've received a complaint. I know it's strange, but I have to inform you. Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, a weary smile crossing her face. So this is the play, she whispered to herself. Ava, standing nearby, shook her head in disbelief. The escalation had already begun. By dawn, blogs and fringe outlets broke the story. Barron Trump files police report against Crockett. The framing was instant and vicious. Conservative anchors thundered across morning broadcasts that Jasmine had crossed a sacred line. Words like harassment and persecution flooded the airwaves. Panels of commentators leaned in, voices raised, turning oversight into alleged cruelty. Progressive explainers, however, moved just as quickly. Clips of Jasmine's exact words played on loop, not implying. The records exist. Analysts pointed out the absence of names, the precision of her statement, the professionalism of her tone. Oversight isn't optional, one anchor reminded viewers. It's the constitutional role of Congress. The divide was stark. With each side holding its ground, the country caught in the churn of spin and truth. On the Capitol steps later that morning, Jasmine faced a swarm of cameras. The crowd pressed forward, microphones jostling, reporters shouting for comment. She stood steady, voice clear, eyes unwavering. Oversight isn't a crime, it's my job, and no, I won't apologize. Her words cut through the chaos, carried live on every network, replayed instantly across feeds. The simplicity of her stance turned into a soundbite that resonated far beyond Washington. Within hours, online echoes swelled. Teachers recorded short videos from their classrooms, pointing to peeling paint and broken desks, declaring, "She asked a question, they called the cops." Veterans uploaded clips of themselves, uniforms framed behind them, supporting Jasmine's demand for accountability. Students posted their own testimonies, amplifying the absurdity of calling police over oversight. The phrase, "oversight isn't a crime," became more than a quote. It became a chant, printed on signs, trending across feeds, worn as a badge of defiance. Inside her office, Ava scrolled through the responses, half amazed, half bracing for the next strike. "This won't stop here," she muttered, adjusting her glasses as a new flood of alerts poured in. Jasmine, seated across from her, simply opened another binder, flipping to a fresh page. She knew Ava was right. The first blows had landed, but the fight was far from over. The confrontation had officially moved beyond the debate stage. It was now a national reckoning, where every silence, every word, every receipt would be weaponized. The spark had turned into fire, and fire was spreading. The moment the cameras cut away from the debate stage, the clip was already spreading at the speed of outrage. By midnight, 3 hashtags dominated timelines: public funds, public truth, Barron called 911, and stop to smear. Each hashtag carried its own army. Some accounts clipped Jasmine Crockett's words into 30-second loops, overlaid with bold subtitles so they could auto-feed silently in grocery store aisles. Others paired the same footage with grainy photos of Trump family galas, demanding answers about where the money had gone. And then came the backlash, polished conservative influencers posting, "First they come for your schools, next they come for your family." Every major network recognized the spark immediately. Producers who had been bracing for a dull news cycle now had something electric. Cable chyrons ran on an endless loop. Oversight or overreach? CNN froze the exact second JD Vance blinked, turning it into a still image of hesitation. Fox News highlighted Barron's police call as evidence of harassment, takes Pete Bloom's, stares Chasebank's calm stare, labeling it the look that landed. The clip was no longer a moment. It had become a national mirror. Late-night comedy shows pounced with the same mix of glee and discomfort that defined cultural turning points. One monologue opened with a joke that ricocheted across TikTok. 911, what's your emergency? She had receipts. The audience erupted, laughter filling the studio, but the comedian dropped his grin halfway through. No, but really, when did asking where money goes become a crime? That's not comedy. That's civics. The laughter gave way to quiet applause, a rare moment of late-night reflection. TikTok lawyers stitched the debate clip into earnest explainers. A young attorney in glasses leaned against a kitchen counter, captioned with the phrase, "Public trust isn't harassment." She broke down in 30 seconds how donor funds, especially when tax-deductible, must be transparent. High school civics teachers saw an opening. Across the Midwest and South, classrooms rolled down projector screens, playing Jasmine's calm delivery. Students scribbled on worksheets labeled "Trust Chain," who holds the receipts. For once, campaign finance law was no longer buried in textbooks. It was dinner table conversation. Meanwhile, Jasmine's office buzzed. Like a command center, Ava fielded media requests, each more desperate than the last. Journalists wanted her live on Sunday shows, Monday night panels, and local morning radio. Ava's inbox filled with subject lines screaming urgency, critical moment, voice of the people, don't miss this chance. Yet Jasmine resisted saturation. Her mantra was sharp, let the record speak. Our job isn't to flood. In Washington, that restraint only heightened curiosity. Each refusal made producers replay the clip more, filling silence with speculation. By the third night, the phrase had entered cultural shorthand. At gas stations, people joked about leaking ceilings when the pump malfunctioned. At diners, waitresses muttered, "We care about optics, not leaks," with an eye roll. The sentence was no longer just hers. It had slipped into the bloodstream of American sarcasm. The media detonation wasn't just about a line. It was about the fracture it exposed. Everyone could feel it. Every replay deepened the sense that this wasn't ending anytime soon. What began as a controlled debate question had ripped open something raw, and the country couldn't look away. Across the country, conversations divided like fault lines. In school cafeterias, children parroted their parents, one side saying Crockett was brave enough to tell the truth, the other calling her mean to the family. In church basements, after Wednesday night service, older members argued softly over folding tables. One group warned that attacking Trump's name was attacking America itself. Another group, equally devout, countered, "Didn't Jesus flip the tables when the temple was corrupted? Maybe asking questions about money is the same thing." Barbershops hummed with debate, clippers buzzing over voices raised. "She didn't flinch," one man said, waving a comb in the mirror. "That's how you know she meant it." Across town, another shop blasted Fox on the TV in the corner, hosts painting Crockett as the radical face of Washington's harassment campaign. Patrons nodded grimly, muttering about unfair treatment of a president's family. Pollsters rushed out flash surveys within 48 hours. Numbers told the story of polarization in real time. Independents, weary of spectacle, leaned Jasmine's way, describing her as principled and unshaken. The MAGA base, however, tightened its grip around Trump, viewing the sentence as an assault on family honor. Moderates wobbled, unsure if this was oversight or overstep. For strategists on both sides, the data was oxygen. Inside Jasmine's district office, the divide showed up in ink and paper. Stacks of handwritten letters arrived, written in shaky cursive and bold markers alike. One came from a retired teacher in Michigan. "We carry papers like armor. Thanks for asking, who else shoulds?" Another came from a mother in Arizona. "My son's roof leaks in his school. Thank you for saying what we feel." Ava read them aloud during late nights, her voice cracking on certain phrases. They weren't just voters, they were lived experiences echoing back. But the backlash was no less intense. Conservative activists staged small rallies with posters reading "Protect our families" and "Oversight is overreach." Phone lines in Crockett's office buzzed with threats disguised as questions. "How would you like it if they asked about your family?" Ava logged every message carefully, but the undercurrent of menace was real. Jasmine herself, though, remained steel. They confuse personal with public. That's their shield. But shields can crack. And then came Caroline Leavitt's silence. Once a rising star of combative press conferences, she suddenly canceled podcast appearances. Invitations to small-town fundraisers went unanswered. Insiders whispered that she was shaken, haunted by memories of her own viral silence when confronted weeks earlier. Screenshots circulated online, side-by-side stills of Caravine Motley and JD Vance blinking, tagged with captions like "Silence is contagious." Her retreat became part of the narrative. Even absence was political. The public split wasn't just ideological, it was emotional. Families argued at dinner tables, neighbors at fence posts, co-workers during lunch breaks. The sentence had reached beyond politics into identity. Were you the kind of person who asked questions, or the kind of person who considered questions an attack? That was the dividing line now, and nobody could cross it without declaring who they were. While the public roared, institutions began to move with their slower, heavier rhythm. On Capitol Hill, two familiar names, Maddox and Briggs, seized the microphone. Together they filed a formal resolution to censure Jasmine Crockett. Cable networks responded instantly, slapping countdown clocks in the corner of broadcasts. Censure vote in 48 hours. The theater was obvious, but the stakes felt real. It wasn't just a motion. It was a message to anyone who dared to pierce the Trump brand. Leaks compounded the drama. A White House insider handed reporters a memo outlining dueling strategies. Melania, ever distant from the fray, advised silence. Do not give her more attention. But Trump's handwriting scrawled in the margins told a different story. Double down, attack back, make it survival. The contradiction leaked before evening shows, sparking another round of Meanwhile, protests erupted nationwide. They weren't massive marches, but they carried symbolic weight. In Albuquerque, parents held signs outside a crumbling elementary school. Public money, public answers. In Miami, veterans draped banners over courthouse steps. Oversized patriotism. Picture-type dots on a map but united in tone. Hand-painted posters filled streets, voters foot up and open until they created a mosaic of defiance. Committees within Congress also stirred. Quietly, without cameras, clerks issued requests for reconciliation of donor flows linked to Trump's fundraising machine. Lawyers shuffled papers. Lobbyists whispered nervously. The surface spectacle masked deeper tremors. Crockett's sentence had unlocked more than headlines. It had triggered audits. Then, in a surprising twist, Caroline Leavitt finally broke her silence. At a small event in Concord facing a modest crowd, she admitted, "I defended what I didn't fully understand. We owe voters clarity." Her voice shook but did not surrender. She wasn't betraying the movement, but her fracture was undeniable. Within hours, clips of her words spread online tagged, "Clarity over Stin." Supporters cheered her honesty. Clips pounced on her weakness. Either way, the damage was done. A once unidentified front had its first visible crack. Back in Washington, Jasmine listened to coverage in her office, pen tapping against a legal pad. Ava looked up, weary. "They're trying to bury you." Jasmine smiled faintly. "They should try harder. Paper doesn't rot." She wasn't wrong. For every attack, more documents surfaced reinforcing her position. For every attempt at silencing, more Americans spoke up. The ripples had become waves, and the waves were rolling toward the institutions that once thought themselves untouchable. The sentence had left the stage. It was no longer about the debate, the moment, or even the media cycle. It was about what happened when truth, once spoken aloud, demanded to be followed. The halls of power were beginning to realize they couldn't control the tide. The first ripple came not from Washington, but from the schools. Students who had watched Jasmine's quiet but unflinching words on their phones began showing up to homerooms with handwritten placards instead of notebooks. They weren't scrawled with typical slogans. They were covered in questions. Who gets to buy influence? If teachers have to beg for supplies, why not candidates? Across cafeteria tables, students debated the meaning of transparency in government more passionately than they had ever spoken about test scores or sports schedules. Teachers who once struggled to make civics lessons feel relevant found their classrooms alive with arguments that carried the weight of personal stakes. Veterans were next. At VFW halls over coffee poured into chipped mugs, the conversations turned from routine grievances to moral clarity. "We fought for transparency, not curated secrecy," one Marine told a local reporter, holding up his discharge papers as if they were proof of principle. "If the government tracks us for every penny, why can't politicians account for theirs?" The sentiment echoed from Kansas to Pennsylvania, carrying a solemnity that couldn't be dismissed as partisan piety. Teachers began weaving Jasmine's clip directly into their lesson plans. Some asked students to create their own public accountability checklists. Others structured group projects around the idea of what should never be hidden from taxpayers. In small towns and large cities alike, those lesson plans didn't feel like abstractions. They carried the immediacy of leaking ceilings in schools, the broken air conditioners in classrooms, and the old desks scarred by generations of youth. Immigrant families added another layer. On social media, they began posting their own paper trails. Every form, every fee, every copy of every background check or financial disclosure they had endured just to live and work legally. The message was clear. Ordinary families had to account for every line of their lives. Why shouldn't leaders who claim to serve them do the same? Those posts traveled fast, cutting through the noise of partisan spin, tying the broader demand for public trust to the intimate struggles of daily life. By the end of the week, it wasn't just political insiders dissecting Jasmine's words. It was classrooms, union halls, kitchen tables, and waiting rooms in hospitals. The cultural shift wasn't loud in tone, but it was insistent in rhythm. It suggested that her sentence on that debate stage had seeded something larger, a conversation about fairness that people didn't want to let go of. While cultural currents swelled, the political machinery moved with urgency. Jasmine's campaign account on ActBlue began flashing alerts no one had anticipated. Small dollar donations poured in by the thousands. Retirees sent $10 with notes that said, "Keep asking." Single parents sent $5 with messages like, "For every time I had to explain my receipts." Within 48 hours, her digital fundraising team reported totals that rivaled entire months of effort. What struck analysts wasn't just the money, but the pattern. It came from districts both blue and red, suggesting her line had cut across partisan assumptions. Trump and Vance's camp responded with equal velocity. At a strategy dinner in Palm Beach, Trump's press secretary Dent laid out the new talking points. Make it about protecting the family, don't argue the receipts. Argue the insult. The next morning, fundraising emails blasted across conservative inboxes with subject lines like, "She attacked our children" and "Stand with JD." Checks flowed in from loyal donors, proof that outrage, when framed as personal, still carried currency. But the stakes stretched beyond fundraising. Capitol Police quietly expanded Jasmine's security detail after her office reported a wave of coordinated threats mixed in with disinformation campaigns. Fake screenshots circulated online claiming she had doctored receipts. Anonymous accounts flooded comment sections, painting her as unhinged. The threats weren't just digital. They carried enough specificity to force law enforcement into high alert. Inside Congress, the confrontation turned procedural. A bipartisan group of lawmakers began drafting the outline for new hearings on donor transparency, knowing the moment couldn't simply be swept aside. Committees prepared subpoenas, compliance memos circulated, and whispers about cleaning up campaign finance began moving from fringe chatter to legitimate policy proposals. Jasmine had forced a wedge issue into daylight, and it wasn't going back into the shadows. The grassroots energy crystallized into a banner, the Same Standard movement. It wasn't limited to party affiliation. Student clubs adopted it. Veterans halls endorsed it. Even some teachers' unions carried the phrase on homemade banners. The movement's premise was simple. If citizens had to live under scrutiny, leaders should face the same expectation. Its clarity made it nearly impossible to dismiss without appearing hypocritical. Meanwhile, inside corporate offices of super PACs and major lobbying firms, a quieter shift began. Compliance officers recommended returning donations that could later prove toxic. New brand use protocols were circulated, limiting the kind of lavish spending Jasmine had exposed. What once passed as normal politicking suddenly felt radioactive under public scrutiny. By the close of the month, political fallout was everywhere. In swollen donation numbers, in new hearings, in elevated security, in recalibrated donor strategies. What had begun as one sentence in a debate had grown into a national reckoning, tightening its grip on both the cultural imagination and the political calculus of Washington. The story of this confrontation was never just about one viral clip, or even about one politician finding the courage to ask the unasked. It became a mirror held up to the nation, forcing Americans to confront a question that had long been buried under headlines and fundraising appeals. Who truly owns influence in this democracy? When Jasmine looked across the stage and refused to flinch, she revealed not just a political vulnerability in her opponent, but an ethical fracture that stretched across the entire system. That is why her moment resonated beyond Washington. Because people in every corner of the country know what it feels like to be measured, monitored, and held accountable in their daily lives. Students, veterans, teachers, immigrants, and families, all of them recognized their own struggles in her words. They saw the double standard she laid bare. They felt the weight of hypocrisy fall like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward into communities that had grown used to being ignored. The fallout was messy, raw, and polarizing. But in that polarization lay something vital. proof that people still care, that Americans still debate not just personalities but principles, that civic energy, even when jagged and imperfect, still burns. And maybe that is the most hopeful part of this entire saga, the reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It is a fight to demand answers, to demand honesty, and to demand that leaders meet the same standards as the people they serve. So where does this leave us? It leaves us staring at the same choice that faced Jasmine on that stage. Do we keep quiet, look away, and accept the curated version of politics fed to us? Or do we step forward, even if our voice shakes, and insist that public life must belong to the public? That choice doesn't live in the hands of one congresswoman, or one governor, or one senator. It lives in all of us. And here is where you come in. If you believe that politics should be about truth, not theater, about accountability, not image, then this is your moment too. Share this story. Talk about it with your friends, your classmates, your co-workers, your family. Don't let it fade into the endless churn of outrage and distraction. Carry it forward. Demand receipts not just from your leaders. Because in the end, democracy is not just defended in courtrooms or committee hearings. It is defended at dinner tables, at ballot boxes, in conversations, and in the courage to say, we deserve better. That is what Jasmine proved, and that is what this story demands. The question now is whether we will answer it. If you believe in that answer, if you believe in the fight for accountability, join us, subscribe, stay engaged, and help keep this movement alive.